Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Being an Austrian, I thought we can talk about the Austrian school, and I'm the short time available referring to two famous names. Eugen von Boehm-Bawerk, who came actually from Innsbruck to Vienna, and there's a colleague here from Innsbruck. And the second one would be Alois Schumpeter, who in part is a little bit on the fringes, I would say, of the Austrian school. So let's, Eugen von Boehm-Bawerk, his famous two-volume work, Capital and Capital Interest. I'm referring to the second part, the positive theory of capital, which was a provocative title at the time and catapulted Boehm-Bawerk himself and the Austrian school to international fame, because written in 1889 in Innsbruck still. It was translated within 2 years, both in London and in New York, into English. So it made the Austrian school international, one could say. I'm taking this particular graph, which is not from Boehm-Bawerk. It's from Wicksell, who summarized the positive theory of capital in a one-page graph ingeniously, and he, mind you, produced a production function 35 years earlier than Cupp and Douglas, 1928, in the American Economic Review. On the vertical side, it's simply the productivity, and on the horizontal, it's the production period, which is important in the Bawerkian context. And on the horizontal opposite side, and that's Wicksell's ingenious contribution, he measures the roundaboutness of production. And so we have vertical side, as at labor productivity, production period, and I'm really making it very short here. Let's say the utopian measure of Bawerk of a mature capitalism is this formula, 2 over indefinite, and that's always approaching 0. And that's what Boehm-Bawerk posed against Karl Marx. And Karl Marx, you could call it the negative theory of capital, and Boehm-Bawerk said positive theory of capital. In other words, we do not need Marx to explain the social process, or let's say the development of capitalism. And in mature capitalism, and now it's pure marginal utility theory, which is so very Austrian neoclassical. In mature capitalism, capital accumulation will reach a level where every additional unit of capital approaches the value of 0. I'll make it again very short, and that's this formula. If you take this function, and let's say this would be mature capitalism at the end of the curve, then you can imagine the asymptotical approach on the left side of the graph would go very, very, very far out indefinitely. So each additional unit of capital approaches the value of 0. And if this is the case, and that's now, let's say, the twist of the argument, we do not need Marx. Because if this is the case, there's no point anymore to argue that there are owners of capital and there are non-owners of capital, then the class antagonism will vanish. So the system of capitalism can deliver this out of its own strength. That's, in a really sort of nutshell, Bawerk's positive theory of capital, reinterpreted by Wicksell. Bawerk entertained a very, very famous seminar in Vienna, which was, of course, an anti-Marxist seminar, but it attracted the crème de la crème of the economists at the time, including left-leaning ones like Hilferding or others from the, let's say, more socialist side. And one of the participants, apart from me, says, and the whole peers of the Austrian school, was a young scholar called Alois Schumpeter. And now let's go. This is very cumbersome. That's what very few know. That's the original version, the German version, 1912, of his famous theory of economic development. Translated in 1934 at Harvard, and this is what probably most of you are familiar with. With a cumbersome subtitle and a little bit truncated compared to the early condition. Now, Bawerk was a role model for Schumpeter and supported Schumpeter in his career very much. Also, he never became professor in Vienna, as you know. Schumpeter took up the Austrian school and took up Bawerk as well, criticizing that the approach also of the positive theory of capital was a static one, and the Austrian school was arguing in a static way. In the second chapter of the theory of development, the caption is the circular flow of economic life as conditioned by given circumstances. That's the static. And Schumpeter admired, to a certain extent, Karl Marx, as you know. And I quote, "The only major attempt toward a problem of development is the one of Karl Marx." His economic theory is aiming at the evolution of economic life as such, and the circular flow. So that means dynamics. And in a short version, in dynamic terms, Schumpeter takes position against Marx too. I think he said what Marx can tell us about economics and the dynamics of economics, we can also tell in terms of capitalist development. Again, we do not need Marx to explain in dialectic terms the economic process. And let's take it for the argument together to follow this argumentation. The famous, powerful sentence of Marx, his thesis, the economic process is anytime and everywhere a social process. So no competition, socialized markets, and so on. Schumpeter takes it as the thesis, well, we take the system as it is, it's a market-based system, it's our capitalism. And the antithesis of Marx then says, well, because of that, there are owners of capital in a capitalist system and there are non-owners of capital in a capitalist system. And that's the antagonism of driving the system in a dialectic sense. And Schumpeter takes it in a completely different direction. He says, yes, there are dynamics, but who provides the dynamics? The antithesis in Schumpeter's terms is the entrepreneur. It's the entrepreneur, he never wants equilibrium. He never wants to have a resting place in the economic development. But he, in fact, is the driver of economic development and economic dynamics. The synthesis, of course, we know Marx needs a change of the system, from capitalism to socialism with entirely different conditions. And the question is not so obvious. What's the synthesis with Schumpeter? That's, in Schumpeter terms, the observation that economic dynamics, as he interprets it on entrepreneurial terms, takes the economy to a higher level of welfare. That's the dynamics. And it's not a resting place. It goes on, there is no equilibrium, as the static interpretation, the Austrian school interpretation in its core says. There is never an equilibrium in capitalism. And that's, I think, the attractiveness and somehow, to a certain extent, the hidden agenda of the Schumpeterian theory of economic development. Thank you very much.
If we have questions, okay. The first one.
Charlie, yeah.
Just one? I think we have time for the second one also.
My name is Karl Socher from Innsbruck. And
I hear nichts.
It's working.
It's working, yeah. Yes, and you said that Schumpeter had its main contribution was that he showed that innovations, entrepreneurial motives were the growth factor for an economy, and that the economy would grow even when the Marxian conditions were fulfilled. And the difference, I think, between...
I didn't get it at all.
The difference...
I understand innovation and growth, but what did you say?
The growth of the economy could go on because the innovations are giving higher productivity even of capital, and the rate of interest would not fall as it would be with Marx. And then the difference between the Austrian school of Bawerk and was that Schumpeter even thought that there will be innovations in a state, in a socialist state. He described that in a socialist state, without private entrepreneurs, there would be created special forms of government invention research And so he said that even a socialist economy could go on growing, which is against the Mises word that the socialist has to break down because of the calculation debate. And therefore, I think that one cannot say that Schumpeter is an Austrian economist, because Austrian economists are in favor of a free market and private property market economy. Thank you.
Well, but in his Theorie der wirtschaftlichen Entwicklung theory, he's fully, let's say, on the Austrian track, apart from the dynamics, of course. And as it comes to socialism, of course, Charlie, there's always a temptation to dub Schumpeter as a socialist to a certain extent. Capitalism, socialism, and democracy. The first sentence of the chapter of capitalism, you know, can capitalism survive? I don't think so. The first sentence of the chapter of socialism is, can socialism work? Yes, I think so. And then, if you really read it, and I maintain that, it's worth reading. In 1942, it was the first prediction, a subtle and fundamental prediction that socialism can't work and has to succumb to its own internal problems and to misallocations and so on. There's this famous example, he says, well, it only works, and that's the nomenclatura. If you label the nomenclatura on their trousers with a label and make them responsible, what they sort of argue socialism has to provide, and socialism has to, let's say, deliver as a system, but this never works. So I still maintain it's the first prediction of the 1989 downfall of the Soviet system in 1942. And so he has been dubbed as a socialist because of this first sentence, but no one reads the whole story, or very few.
And just a short.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. So Schumpeter got a bit more pessimistic, actually, in Capitalism, Socialism about the entrepreneur.
Rightly, that's a sequel to the German optimistic.
Yeah. So my point is, so he started to distrust entrepreneurship. Yeah, but what that he thought it's going to be bureaucratized.
He didn't distrust it. He despaired about it.
Okay, that's even okay. Anyway, so what the missing point is, and I would like to have your opinion, is the consumer, yeah, as a reactive element in the economy doesn't feature at Schumpeter at all. So he's basically saying nothing about it. That's quite actually interesting to me.
Yes, it's true, but indirectly, yes, if you consider, I mean, that's the subtitle, capital and the business cycle in particular interest, there is an indirect links. But why did he despair? You have to put yourself 1942. That's when the industrial military complexes came up and in fact continued to grow and dominate the economic sphere, the economic systems, both in the United States and then later on in the Soviet Union, of course, anyway. And that made him pessimistic that entrepreneurship, as he saw it, couldn't survive. But this prediction was proved to the contrary, as you know. Now it's not only in scientific terms, entrepreneurship has become a fad, almost a hype in the United States and elsewhere, and small entrepreneurial type businesses are, let's say, complimented everywhere, left and right. One is inclined to say there are more than 400 entrepreneurship chairs have sprung up over the last 3 decades in the United States alone, proving Schumpeter again.
Okay, thank you for your presentation.